I would say, even more knowledgeable in this from working in the city, the school, and so much that she does. Now, as the parent, yes, I have that wonderful side of it, and I know my child as well as many others, and that gives me much wisdom. But she can give you a whole different side of it, and she's here to tell you all a lot of information. So from there, I will pass it on to Ms. Ellen Casali.
It's a scary thought to think that I have all the wisdom on autism. That's not the case. This is a very rapidly growing field. If you don't already know somebody with autism, you will. I'll take a little poll here in a moment. I'll just give a little bit of background about myself. My name is Ellen Casali. I'm an autism specialist. I have an EDS in autism spectrum disorders. So it's at the point now that they're making degrees and doctorates just to reflect this field, because it is such a largely growing field, both in the field of special education and in our communities, as you'll see the impact both in money, dollars, and the workforce as we talk about individuals with autism growing older. So if you have a higher diagnosis rate, you're also going to have a higher occurrence rate in the community in general. So I'm very excited for Light It Up Blue, and that this is a statewide initiative through the Masons. I'm very appreciative of that. And it usually starts just like with this. You have somebody that has a family member or loved one with a disability, and out of that falls the advocacy and the awareness. I'm going to start with just a poll here. I want to provide you an overview of autism spectrum disorders, and if you have questions at any point in time, please feel free to ask me, and I'll do my best to answer them. The one that is difficult to answer is what causes autism, so I'm not touching on that today. That's a 4-hour lecture in and of itself, because there's not a distinct cause for autism. We know there's some risk factors that we can use to evaluate the likelihood that somebody might get autism, but that's one for the purpose of tonight that it would be a much longer explanation. So I'm going to start with just a poll of each of you. Raise your hand if, and then we'll keep it raised on each level here. If you've heard of autism, autistic spectrum disorder, or autistic disorder, please raise your hand. Okay? Okay, go ahead and set them down because we have a lot right there. Next level here, I just want to see how close it is to you. If you have somebody in your neighborhood or church that's affected with an autism spectrum disorder, please raise your hand. Okay, so the numbers went down slightly there. And finally, if you have someone in your family with an autism spectrum disorder, please raise your hand. Okay, so the numbers went down, but as you can see, most all of you are familiar with autism. If you haven't heard of autism yet, you will. It is, I would say, pretty mainstream in both in our movies and our TV shows, things like Parenthood. There's different just mainstream TV shows that this is just a part of it as well. Raise your hand if you've heard of The Big Bang Theory. Okay. Also spotlights an individual on the autism spectrum, and actually use his clips often in my presentations. So I'm going to give you just a background of autism spectrum disorders. This is a graph from the CDC. They have reported the rates increasing. I'm going to show you a graph here in a second, but I want to point something out, and this is very important when we're looking at autism spectrum disorders. This is the 11 states out of 50 that they use for monitoring. Monitoring costs money. It costs a lot of money to get the data from these 11 states. So any of the statistics that you hear from the Center for Disease Control in general are only reflected in these 11 states. That's 11 out of 50. So you have to keep in mind that the information they're getting is jaded by this, okay? Now we do know that the rates are increasing, but it's only based on these 11 monitoring sites. The colors of the sites indicate what disabilities they monitor. If it's blue, they monitor only autism. If it is pink, they monitor autism and cerebral palsy. If it is orange, they monitor autism and an intellectual disability, which was formerly called mental retardation. We now call it intellectual disability. And if it's green, it monitors all of the above: autism, cerebral palsy, intellectual disability, visual impairment, and hearing loss. Okay, so we need to keep in mind this is not representative of the entire United States. Okay, it costs a lot of money, and these are the only states that have the grant to fund the research at this time. So I'm going to show you on the next slide I'll give you a little bit of facts here. What we do know from these 11 monitoring states, that about 1 in 68 children have been identified with an autism spectrum disorder. This is based on tracking in these 11 communities based on 8-year-olds. And the reason we use 8-year-olds is because they tend to be identified in the school system through public schools, and most 8-year-olds are already in school. So what they did is they pulled the files. Each state was slightly different, but they pulled the files of the 8-year-olds being served, and that's how they calculated the percentages there. The picture of autism spectrum disorders continue to change. These numbers are based on children that were 8 in the year 2012. So you have to add on the years of how, in 10 years, those were the kids. So in the year 2022, those are the kids that will be in the workforce or eligible for the workforce. So you have to think, as these kids that have gotten diagnosed with this disability are getting older, this will greatly impact our workforce in the near future. So this is a huge, huge concern because the rates are growing, and therefore our awareness needs to grow. Boys are 5 times more likely than girls to be identified as having an autism spectrum disorder. And there's a couple reasons for that. An autism spectrum disorder is essentially a social disability. That's the biggest earmark. By nature, females are more social creatures, by nature. So what autism looks like for females just looks slightly different, because those girls do tend to communicate more. And I can give you an example. On the caseload that I might work on with 20 kids, I've got 2 females that I work with right now. So that just shows you how prevalent it is with boys. Also, unfortunately, when you have just an X and a Y chromosome, in females with the 2 X's, oftentimes anything that's related genetically can be masked by the 2nd chromosome. So in this case with boys, and I'm sorry, gentlemen, in a room full of gentlemen, the XY, it's not as easy to mask. You only have that one set of genetic information. It occurs across races, across ethnic backgrounds. It does not discriminate. I also do a lot of international work with Compassion International. I work in the Dominican Republic. I do see children with autism there as well. It's a lot harder to find in a lot of other countries just because the social services are not set up to get that information. It's generally diagnosed after age 4. In the state of Alabama, our mean age for diagnosis is 4 years, 8 months. And that's very late. We can diagnose autism about as early as 18 months. They prefer about age 2 as regular communication comes in. Even though it can be diagnosed as early as 2, your window for intervention, which we'll talk about later when it comes to the cost of autism, the cost for autism and serving an individual with autism grows exponentially depending on how much intervention they received early on. And early intervention occurs between age 2 and age 5. Well, if you're not diagnosing a child until age 4, 8 months, it's going to cost that family $2 million more through the course of their life to intervene. And I'll show you some of those numbers a little bit later, and that depends on the functionality of the child. Okay, so these are the numbers based on the monitoring states. Currently we have 11 states, as I showed you before. Those numbers have ebbed and flowed from the years. We've had as many as, I believe, as 14 through the Center for Disease Control. Again, not representative of the entire 50 states, so please keep that in mind. In the year 2000, the prevalence rate for autism was 1 in 150. 2002, it remained the same as 1 in 150, and that was the 14 states. 2004, we had 18 states in that year. Those were based on kids that were born in 1996. The number increased to 1 in 125. In the year 2006, we had 11 monitoring states. That's the middle column. And the rates went to 1 in 110. In the year 2008, those were those children born in the year 2000, because remember we're looking at 8-year-olds, it was 1 in 88. And our most recent information from 2010, which is consistent with the 2012 data, which came from children born in the year 2002, the rates are 1 in 68. There are some studies that show the prevalence rate as high as 1 in 55 births. And again, that depends on where you're getting that data from. And I have also heard that number for North Alabama, just North Alabama in our counties, as high as 1 in 150, or 1 in 50 births, forgive me, 1 in 50. Are there any questions about the rates? I know that's exciting statistics, but I want to ground it knowing that it's only coming from so many states, but it is a rapidly growing number. Okay, so what is autism? I'm going to do a couple different things. I'm going to go over the definition of autism, and there's several terms that have been thrown out. One of the questions I often get is, why has autism increased? Okay? Autism was not a term for diagnosis until 1988. Okay? They had a criteria under something called the pervasive developmental disorder, but the reason you didn't hear autism a lot before that is it wasn't termed as such. Okay, so under the original autism spectrum disorders, in the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, there were 5 disorders or 5 categories within an autism spectrum disorder. And it was under an umbrella. So all of those fell under autism spectrum disorders, the first one being autistic disorder, and it was based on how much the criteria that you met. Asperger's disorder, and I'll do a poll. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Asperger's. Okay, so Asperger's is under that as well, and this becomes very important with how it's defined currently. There was a third one called childhood disintegrative disorder, which is no longer in the DSM-5. There's been a new version that was released in May of 2013. And the reason why is there just wasn't enough cases to warrant keeping it in the diagnostic manual. We also have Rett's disorder, which there is a genetic marker for that. So that actually has been taken out. You can still have a diagnosis for Rett syndrome or Rett's disorder. It affects primarily females. It affects both, but generally the males do not survive. It presents much like autism, except they plateau and or they will digress or lose their skills. That's actually how I started working with children on the spectrum, as I worked with a young lady with Rett's. And she developed very typically until the age of 18 months, plateaued, and then lost all her skills. They disintegrate over time, which is where you get the disintegrative disorder, meaning they continue to lose their skills or they stay at that plateau. They tend to be tube-fed by about age 12, sometimes 13, and they a lot of times end up in use of a wheelchair very early on as well. And then there's a catch-all, which is the pervasive developmental not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS. And what that basically means is they met some, but not all of the criteria of autism. And so originally, this is the spectrum that you would see. We call it a spectrum because if you've met one young man with autism or one lady, you've met exactly one. The more I know about autism, the less I know about autism, because every student or child that I work with is very unique. And though there may be some characteristics across the board on each of them, they're each their own person, and none of them can be served the same, which becomes an issue when you're trying to develop services, because you have to look at them within their own categories. So currently, they have changed that. So Rett's is a medical diagnosis, so it's no longer under the autism umbrella, so to speak. And childhood disintegrative disorder is no longer a diagnosis that they use because there weren't enough cases to warrant it. So that leaves you with 3 categories: PDD-NOS, Asperger's disorder, and autistic disorder. If you were to go get a diagnosis by an updated manual, it would be called ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. You should not be able to go into a clinician or a diagnostician currently and walk out with an Asperger's diagnosis. It is no longer part of the definition. It would fall under autism spectrum disorder. And that leaves for a big argument for people that were previously diagnosed with Asperger's, which is a debate that I could get into if you wanted to know more information about it. But for the purposes of tonight, I'll scoot on past that. So when you're looking at autism spectrum disorders, you're looking at 3 areas: social and communication, which they put together at one; restrictive or repetitive behaviors, and this is a tricky one; and also that it's seen over lifetime, and it's seen across different areas of life, so to speak. It affects them at school and at home. That it's clinically significant. And that comes into play when we talk about, is there a cure for autism? And the answer to that is no. Can you reduce the characteristics of autism so that they no longer qualify on a test? Absolutely. That has happened. But the characteristics, this is a lifelong disability. So I can give a student the skills to respond socially appropriately, and they may be given an assessment and they test out of that window. but they will always have an autism spectrum disorder. It just looks different over lifetime. So I'm going to look just briefly at the areas, and I'm going to show you a clip of a little girl. So when you're diagnosed with autism, they look at 5 areas in the DSM-5. The first one being social and communication. Originally, those were 2 different things they looked at. But let's be honest, you can't be social without communication, and you can't communicate without being social. So they put those 2 categories together. The restrictive and repetitive behaviors. So I'm going to do a call out here. Raise your hand or call out. When I say the word autism, what do you think of? What does it look like to you? Anybody? Nobody? You want to start it off?
What does it look like?
Yeah, what does it look like? When you think autism, I mean, some people might think tantrums or rocking or,
Nonverbal.
Okay, nonverbal. Anybody else? I know plenty of hands. Well, what do you, when the individuals that you know on the spectrum, when you think of autism, what do you think of?
Repetitive motions.
Okay, repetitive motions, hand flapping, maybe rocking. And I know a lot of people think that rocking goes with every child with autism, and it does not. Hand flapping. Any other characteristics that you think of when you hear autism?
Resistant to eating certain types of foods. Or
Yes,
something.
yes, sensory. And I'm going to show you a clip here which will hopefully play into that. But it also has to do with repetitive thoughts, repetitive verbal behaviors. And what I found for my very high-functioning individuals, I mean IQ 147, and that's just what we can test, engineer-minded, I mean brilliant young men, and this is in the 7th grade. Their repetitive behaviors you're not going to see. It's not until you know them very personally that you realize what their repetitive behaviors are. The symptoms are present in early childhood. We just looked to see, it used to be before age 3. Well, that became a problem because, as Nova told you, she's not an autism specialist. And if I were to ask her if her child did joint attention at age 18 months, she is not a specialist. So being able to recall that information, I think from a parent's perspective, is asking a lot. And so a lot of kids did not get diagnosed because their parents and the information that was collected didn't start before age 3. Therefore, they didn't get that diagnosis. That also plays into the diagnostic rate. And then the symptoms cause clinically significant impairment. I always say everybody has a touch of the autism. Some of us have social issues, some of us have communication issues, some of us have repetitive behaviors, some of us are insistent on our sameness, we don't want anything to change, we have our routines, and if you mess with that, we get a little tiffed. And so everybody has a touch of the autism, but is it clinically significant? Is it affecting multiple areas of our life? Is it impairing those areas of our life? And that's how we determine the clinical significance. And finally, does not meet any other criteria for any other condition, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So just to give you some characteristics of what this looks like. One of the earmarks for autism is social reciprocity, your ability to play back and forth in communication. And I describe it as tennis. If I throw you a ball to talk, do you know how to throw that ball back to me? So that's one of the things that we look at there. Nonverbal communicative behaviors. Do you know how to read the body language? Do you understand what it is to be too close or too far away? Do you understand those nonverbal cues that a conversation is over? Many of you raised your hand about the Big Bang Theory. Sheldon is very good at displaying some of these characteristics. And once you know what they are, you'll pick up on them. But again, it's hard to unless you're trained to do so. Lack of facial expressions for some individuals, lack of eye contact or body language. There's also difficulty in developing and maintaining relationships over time. My very high-functioning individuals that were previously diagnosed with Asperger's, this is where you'll see. They can hold a conversation. You wouldn't know anything is different. But when you look at the quality of their relationships over time, they're very superficial. It's very difficult for them to make those connections. And I like to say that they are very real with respect to, they recognize superficial friendships. And so they don't count them as quality friendships over time. So making friends in absence of interest. You guys touched on a lot of the restrictive and repetitive behaviors. It might be a stereotyped repetitive motor movement. It could be flicking your finger. It could be hand flapping. It could be rocking. It could be pacing, lining up items. That to say, every kid that lines up their cars does not have autism, okay? There's, you just have those touch of the autism. I'm one that I want my paper perfectly parallel to the side of my desk. All right, so there's tendencies that are already there. That does not mean that by itself qualifies them as having autism. There's another one on there, echolalia. And what that means is you repeat information or words that you heard. You could have delayed echolalia, meaning that I watched the movie Shrek last night, and then I repeat everything that the donkey said the next day. There was a lapse of time. It could be immediate echolalia, so if I said, hi, how are you? The person repeats back, hi, how are you? Or just the last part, how are you? And there's a lot of research on echolalia, which is very intriguing to me as well, which says a lot about how their brain functions. Insistent on sameness, just being inflexible. If you want to know the quickest way to upset somebody on the spectrum, change their schedule. Move their bed a quarter of an inch. Move something in your classroom. Change the bell schedule at school. My favorite, cancel their favorite TV show.
Known as OCD.
Known as OCD, yes, obsessive compulsive disorder, and we'll touch on that later, because remember, to get autism, technically you can't have any other diagnosis, which doesn't always restrict, but that's the quickest way to usually make somebody on the spectrum upset. And even if they don't do it visually, if they're very high functioning, it induces much anxiety for higher functioning individuals. And I'm just trying to give examples of what we look for when we diagnose. This also includes highly restricted or fixated interest. Kids that can tell you everything about a certain kind of train or a certain kind of car. Or they're obsessed with airplane models. I have kids that can tell you all about, right now the big thing is programming for many of my brilliant young men, and they can tell me everything about computer code, and you lose me at the binary, the zeros and ones, and I'm out. I say there's a klepto tendency. Some kids like to collect. That's their restrictive or repetitive interest as well. They might talk only about certain subjects. Very restrictive if they are verbal. Okay, so I wanted to show you a clip here of, this has to do with the sensory input when you were describing having difficulty with certain foods or clothing textures. I'm going to show you a clip about a young lady named Carly. Carly was on, I think, MSNBC. She's been on The Doctor. She's been on Oprah. She is a child that would be described as severe autism, nonverbal. She has self-injurious behaviors, meaning that she headbangs or harms her body or other people if she's upset. Her parents have worked very, very hard. She has had therapy from early intervention all the way through. They have videotapes. They have logged her progression. And Carly learned how to type. And once she learned how to type what appeared as being somebody with an IQ below 50, we got a window into her world. And so what this clip is showing is how she perceives sensory information. So essentially you have that social communication breakdown, and it's hard to get past that sensory information. So I'm going to show you this clip here, and I'm going to have to leave the screen for just a second. Don't worry about the sound. And she has her own YouTube channel. And this is her speech to text. She has a twin sister who does not have autism. These are quotes from her. So she uses a computer to communicate. She uses text to speech, and she points.
Wait for coffee.
So they're at a coffee shop. I didn't take into account scrubbing. But this will show you the sensory perception. It's running through my cell phone for wireless. And again, she's nonverbal. So imagine the frustration if you can't get the words out as well.
Skin soy latte? Taryn, soy can't be skin.
So these are her thoughts. She's made many different clips just to show what it's like for her.
Orange juice.
No, Dad, I want a coffee. Hot chocolate.
So it's just showing, they're trying to give her choices. She's nonverbal. In her mind, she wants a coffee. She's seeing people look at her. She's hearing all the noises. It's magnified. I've had it described.
So I was thinking of going to Sarah's dinner. Can you give me a ride?
Yeah, sure. Are you cool with taking your sister?
Yeah. Wait. What? I have my own plane.
So just the glare of the glasses, or off the glass, the light back and forth, the cappuccino machine, all of those things are magnified.
Okay, I'll see you tonight, okay?
And she had input on this so that the way it's presented was the way that she sees it, with the foggy glare and such. Actually, she writes all of these. So she's starting to have a panic attack, and what looks like an autism tantrum or meltdown is what ensues immediately afterwards from all this information. She wants something, she can't communicate. All these noises are going off. She's trying to filter through the information. People are staring at her funny. Eye contact is an issue. Just an overwhelming sensation, and then you usually have a meltdown shortly thereafter.
How can I help?
That's Carly. Again, nonverbal. She just learned how to type, and that's the only way that we got this information. And she writes these. If you're able to, it's called Carly's Cafe on YouTube. She has her own channel. She's been on several news stations, gives a lot of information just from a perspective of somebody with nonverbal autism. To me, that's the easiest way, because none of us really understand, unless you have sensory integration dysfunction, like many kids with autism do. It's very difficult for me to visualize it from their perspective. But if you can imagine everything being magnified, the lights right now, having these 3 lights here and these lights running back and forth. These lights, the fluorescent lights, actually run on like a 60-second cycle, and they flicker. And sometimes we pick up on it if we're under them for too long. Kids with autism can pick up on that. I've had it also described that many kids, such as in Carly's case, they take 1,000 pictures of your face every time they look at you. I have a student that literally takes pictures of the computer. And I mean, you will see her blink her eyes and visually take pictures of the computer. And she can tell you if any of the tabs on her Google Chrome have moved. But also gets very overwhelmed instantaneously at something that may just be a blip on the screen, but it will also radiate in her mind as well. I also said, making sure that the symptoms were there early in childhood helps to diagnose it. Again, clinically significant. Okay, these are my 3 fun theories with respect to autism. So the diagnosis to me is just, okay, we have the diagnosis. But these 3 theories right here, and again, they're theories because there's no way to test or assess these, really unlocked autism. And this part is a little bit interactive if you'd like to think of it that way. We know that people with autism have issues in these 3 areas: executive functioning, which is your ability to make a task or a plan or what have you and execute it; impaired theory of mind, which is perspective taking; and then a theory of weak central coherence. So instead of me explaining those to you, I have a couple things that will show it to you. So executive functioning has to do with planning, organization, time management, working memory. And you may or may not see other people on the spectrum. Remember, this doesn't diagnose them by itself. Metacognition, or your ability to think about your thinking. This is another little clip, and this is an interactive one. So I'll tell you before this one starts that you need to count how many times the people in white pass the ball. Okay? People in white. This is a video clip that will show you how executive functioning works. So people in white, and count how many times they pass the ball. It'll repeat the direction, but it goes very quickly. So the volume's irrelevant. Just a little brain work for you. How many passes? Anybody count?
15.
Did anybody see the gorilla?
Yep.
Here's the same clip again. 15 passes is correct. I stopped counting when I saw the gorilla. So it'll play here again.
Yeah, I saw the gorilla.
Yes, run it back. And the second I saw that, I lost focus. I'm like, why is there a gorilla? The teacher in me is wondering why they're playing basketball outside the elevators, why there's a letter S. So I just wanted to show you how all of you can see the same thing, yet not see the same thing. Okay? So imagine a child with autism getting all of that information simultaneously. So that shows, for me, shows that executive functioning, that brain functioning. To me, this is easier than explaining these theories, but I just wanted to give you an example how all of us can see that, yet not see it. Okay, this also includes executive functioning, also includes response inhibition, your ability to not respond to something. That impulse control falls in this same category. And self-regulation of emotions, all of that falls in that same category. I want to go to theory of mind, and this is, if you don't work in the field of psychiatry or education, you may not know about this. Theory of mind is something that all children master generally by age 4. It's your ability to see things from other kids' perspectives. This is another test. I'm going to show it to you. Children with autism never inherently get this. They have to actively do this. This is never natural. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like, and hopefully that will make more sense. So this is a test in the field of psychology. It's called the Sally Ann test. And I'll speak a little bit louder. So this is a young man with autism, age 9. So she's got 2 good dolls, Sally and Ann. She's asking him to identify which doll is which, just to make sure he understands which one's Sally, which one's Ann. He correctly points to both. One has a basket and one has a box. She hands him a ball. She's telling a story. So they put it in Sally's basket. Sally goes outside to play. While Sally's gone, Ann comes and moves the ball to the basket. Okay, so he already cognitively understands which one's which. They identified that early on. And the question is, where will Sally say that the ball is? Okay, remember, one of the dolls left. An individual with autism cannot answer that question correctly. They can only do it based on their perspective. For him, he's saying that she's going to think it's in the box because he watched it move to the box. So to me, this was cornerstone for working with my kids on the spectrum. Because if you've ever seen somebody with Asperger's or higher functioning autism and they have an argument, at this point they only see it from their perspective. And so that part falls in there as well. So that, to me, explains theory of mind. And I have one more to show you quickly. And this is another interactive one for those of you that like puzzles or games. And there's also a Sheldon clip I usually show here. But for the purpose of tonight, I'll skip through it. And this is the theory of weak central coherence, which basically means you either see all the details and never see the big picture, or you only see the big picture and never see the details. And an example in this room would be, you might have an individual with autism that could tell me almost instantly how many grains or how many slots are on the wooden walls. They would be able to tell you that almost right away. Okay, I think if it went red, does that mean it's dead? Okay. Okay. So, I'm going to show you a picture. I want you to tell me how many squares are in the picture. If you can see it, I know it's very close. Just make a guesstimate. I have some students that could answer this instantaneously. I have others that it would take them a few minutes, but they would see them all. You may have seen something similar to this. Just shout out your numbers.
25.
27.
27.
24.
32.
24.
More than that.
Keep going.
More than what?
There's 40.
40.
40. Okay, so you've got the individual small cells. You have the squares that would be 2 by 2. You have the squares that would be 3 by 3. Don't forget you would have the overlapping ones in the middle. You have 4 3 by 3. Of course, you've got the actual square itself. You have the small squares in the middle. I don't have them highlighted, but there's 40. I'll be happy to email it to you if you want to count and prove me wrong. I'll be happy to do it. But my point being there that individuals on the spectrum can see all those details, but if I ask them what is that a picture of, they would say, they would not recognize that it was a picture of a square, if that makes sense. They would see all the little squares, but the rest would not compute. There's a clip there of Sheldon, but for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to skip over them. And Temple Grandin. Temple Grandin is another individual with autism that she has a PhD. In this little clip, and I won't show it because you have to hear her there, it's essentially just describing how people with autism think in pictures, okay? And this is just her insight. Not everybody with autism we can verify would think like this, but let me give you an example. If you were to tell Temple Grandin shoe, like, I like your new shoes, when she hears the word shoe, she immediately pictures shoes from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. That one word triggers, like you would the internet, all of these hits on that one word. So if you're trying to have a conversation with somebody with autism and every word that's a noun triggers 1,000 pictures in their head, you can see how they might quickly become distracted and or have difficulty in the conversation. So I'm not going to play this one because of the speech. It would just be hard to hear her. But she gives an example there. She's another name in autism. And when I'm wrapping it up here, these are several other conditions that often get diagnosed with autism, which is ironic because if you looked at the definition, they can't qualify for any other conditions, okay? ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, epilepsy, seizure disorder, seizure activity in kids with autism. 30 to 50% of kids on the spectrum also have seizures. Many of them undiagnosed because we know that their brains function differently. Oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, which is exactly what it sounds like. An insistence on doing it my way. If you told me to do it another way, or told it to do it your way, I would immediately defy you. And that's how we perceive that. But I would challenge you, not that that makes it socially appropriate at all, that has a lot to do with their theory of mind. I only see it my way, therefore your way doesn't matter, because I can't perceive it. So it's very telling there. Tourette's syndrome, which is repetitive verbal tics or physical tics. Sleep disorders. Nova, have you guys struggled with sleep?
Actually, he's a great sleeper.
Okay, good. That's very common in a lot of my parents. Kids sleep little or not at all. You may have seen in the news many kids with autism disappearing in the middle of night, and you're thinking, how can that happen? Well, if you have a kid that only sleeps 45 minutes a night, eventually you're just going to crash. But these kids also wander in the middle of the night. Their minds wander and they physically wander. So that is a huge issue. There's an initiative actually through the sheriffs in the state of Alabama and through the Autism Society in developing, it's essentially like a GPS wrist that they use so that the sheriffs or police can quickly find the kids when they start to wander. Anxiety disorders, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, mood disorders, learning disabilities, food allergies, any allergies for that matter, poor reading comprehension, SLD, and written expression. And all of that to say, like I said, every kid with autism is completely different and you'll never get the same one. It's on a spectrum, and I pointed out 3 little caveats of persons with autism. You can have one that's verbal, above average intelligence, but might have a severe sensory aversion, may be very picky about what he eats or what he wears. You might have one that's verbal, average intelligence, holds a regular job, but has just severe anxiety. You might have a child that is nonverbal, like the example I gave of Carly, with severe self-interest behaviors. They might headbang, they might bite themselves, and may need a lot of assistance day to day. So I'm going to leave you, we're going to touch on the cost of autism. The lifetime cost ranges from between $2.4 million and $1.4 million, and much of that is dependent on how independent they are. That's essentially one of the main earmarks. It costs the United States $236 billion a year to serve individuals on the spectrum. I also want to point out that yes, you can have above average intelligence and qualify for a job, but we have many individuals on the spectrum with PhDs that work in libraries because they don't have, and that's just an example, not all of them work in libraries, they don't have the social skills that you need. Social IQ is more determinant of your success in the workplace than your IQ. And if anybody's just worked with somebody that's exceptionally intelligent, you may be able to relate to that. So even though they have the verbal ability to hold a job, they don't have the social IQ to work through a business deal to stay in that same field. Okay, so that's it. Just because they have the IQ and the verbal ability doesn't mean they're successful there. The treatment of autism, there is no cure, as I said before. However, with successful therapies, the characteristic effects can be diminished. Meaning I could test a kid with autism. This doesn't happen often, by the way. That I could test a kid with autism at 3, and I could test that child again at age 12 after verbal therapy, applied behavior analysis, educational intervention, medical or psychotropic intervention for medications, etc. And he could test higher or test off, depending on where he was before. But it's a lifelong disability. Early intervention has the best outcome, as I touched on earlier, age 2 to 5. But Alabama, as an example, if we're not diagnosing you till 4 years, 8 months, and I'll ask for an example, how long after you got the diagnosis did you feel prepared to actually line up interventions? I mean, you have how long?
Immediately.
Immediately. How long do you think it took to get the ball rolling? Just an estimate.
He was diagnosed probably when he was between 2 and 2.5.
Okay,
And
good. Those
he
are
was in early intervention before he was 3.
okay. So he would have met that criteria, but even then it was almost 6 months. If he was diagnosed at 2.5, that's 6 months of intervention, just to get therapies lined up. Time is very, very precious. And then the cost. What do these costs equate to? Respite care. You can't just call any babysitter to watch somebody with severe autism. You cannot. You think about the impact on marriage, and as a husband and wife, if you have a child with any disability in general that it does not have a cure, it affects the marriage unit in the family in the same way that if you had lost a child. It's the same effect on that marriage because both of you are tackling it together, but there's huge effects there because there's no one to generally help you watch your child. Applied behavior analysis, or ABA therapy, has the most research behind it, methodology, and has he gone through ABA? Did you guys do any out-of-pocket expenses?
Minimally, but not.
They, very costly, the tune of $40 an hour. They recommend 40 hours a week for the best outcomes. You do the math, okay? Occupational therapy, behavior cognitive therapy, medical expenses. Autism is not recognized by many insurance companies. Triad just started to recognize it within the military, high prevalence rates in the military as well. The insurance, and there is a write-in, if you wanted to speak to that, there's information for Lighted Up Blue Legislative Day, is when many advocates for autism go down to help push for insurance to help recognize this. So these are out-of-pocket expenses, essentially. The school district, if they're in public school, will cover, of course, anything that's related to their education to an extent, but that's like asking a Cadillac for a Taurus, okay? Or a Mercedes versus a Taurus. They don't owe you the Mercedes. They have to give you something that's comparable to, just that the child's being educated. So you have to keep that in mind as well. We do have evidence-based practices in the school system, and the rest is just picture slides more for if you wanted to see what it looks like in classrooms and things that we physically do to organize space for kids with autism. You can see very minimal things on the wall. Schedules are imperative for kids on the spectrum. To me, it's the wheelchair. The schedule might change over time, but they always need to have a schedule of what's going on. These are examples, as I said, in the classroom. structured teaching, visual. You have to see visual cues. We oftentimes, especially for my engineer-minded young men, I have to put a number to everything. And so I've taught a lot of kids on a scale like this, and even then they'll come up with, I'm at a 5.275 right now because their brains can go to those extents. But these are examples just of ways that we have to avoid verbal language, especially for nonverbal kids. Timers are something that we use as well. So I'll leave you with that. I know I ran you a bit over there, but as I said, I could talk for hours and hours on autism. This is my information or contact. Again, I'm an autism specialist with Decatur City Schools. I appreciate the fundraising that you guys are doing. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact me or Nova, and she'll get in touch with me. I appreciate your time this evening. Any questions? Probably more than you were expecting, I guess. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I want to thank you for coming and making the presentation. That gives us a lot more awareness and where we can go. And since we have the Grand Lodge representative here, he will probably be talking to you a lot.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time this evening, gentlemen.
Any questions for the ladies?
Anybody wanting to babysit? Because we have a long line.
Do we need to get out so y'all can do some things? Or-
No.
No.
Virgil, would you lead us in the closing prayer?